Hello and welcome to Good Grief. This session is called Finding Your Grief Tribe, the Importance of Community and Connection. I'm so delighted that you've joined us today. My name is Dr. Lucy Salmon. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at University of Bristol and I'm the founder of Good Grief Festival. And I'm really delighted to be joined by three panellists today. So just some brief intros and panellists would also introduce themselves when we start talking. So Amber Jeffrey created the Grief Gang Instagram page and podcast 3 years after her mum's untimely death from a heart attack in 2016 when Amber was just 19. The strapline of Amber's podcast is Welcome to the Gang, the one you never asked to be a part of. Amber, thank you so much for joining us. And then we've got Dr. Julian Abel. He's a retired palliative care doctor, director of Compassionate Communities UK, an author and podcaster. And over the last decade, he's become increasingly interested in the impact of compassion being the basis of human relationships. He's applied this in healthcare, communities, and beyond. He's published a book called The Compassion Project, and he has a podcast called Survival of the Kindest. So thank you so much for joining us, Julian.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
And finally, we have Amahra Spence, an artist, cultural producer, and spatial practitioner who views her intergenerational work through the lenses of equity, service, and community. And Amahra is based in Birmingham, and she works with Black communities nationally. And through her organisation, Maya, she explores in particular how the arts can be used to build community infrastructure that can help people with their grief. So thank you so much for joining us, Amahra.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I thought we could just start with a really general question. So what do you think the importance of community is when it comes to supporting people in their grief or going through grief itself? Amber.
First.
Yeah, go for it.
It's something I was looking at Julian. Well, yeah, for me, obviously, my whole sort of thing now is community. The Grief Gang, it started off as an Instagram page and then it went into podcast. To give example, like community, it started off with really like low numbers, just very like personal friends and family, and then it's just expanded in the year and a half that it's been, because there's something about a community who has been through what you have been through. It's embracing, knowing that you're amongst people who have potentially walked the same path as you and been through the same troubles as you. You know that if you want to type something or speak to someone, you know you're not going to be met with, oh, a bit weird. You're going to be met with, yeah, I get it. And that's so, the only word I describe it is liberating. Liberating to be amongst people who, instead of shaming you and ostracizing you, just go, yeah, me too.
Yeah, because there is the kind of awkwardness that some people have around grief, isn't there? Or the kind of fear of, oh, I might say the wrong thing, and oh, I better not say anything, because if I say the wrong thing and the person gets upset, you know, what will I do, kind of thing. But I think what you're talking about is how actually, if you've been through it yourself, or even if you haven't been through it, but you just dare to take that step, you find that the connection and sense of support that comes from that is worth so much. It's kind of worth taking the risk, I suppose that's what I'm saying.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. I think when people, the thought of potentially listening to, say, my podcast, and if you were to read its bio and it's called The Grief Gang for one, you would think that's a bit morbid. And you were to enter the community and you say, oh, you know, come online and, you know, speak to people who have had people die in their lives, you think, oh God, even if I know some people even who are bereaved, that is a very daunting thing of being, it almost feels really overwhelming of, is this just going to be really heavy? And it's not. It can be so uplifting and inspiring, and motivating. I think that's one thing that the community does, is it educates people for one, and it inspires people to go into their everyday lives and speak openly about their grief and their loss. The community gives people the tools and the language to go out and do that. Sort of like the first, like, how to say, not like the dummy class, but like we're like the teachers, and we're like coaching you, like, you can do it, you can do it, you can go. You don't have to just do it online. You don't have to just keep your grief for expressing it online. You can go out and speak to your friends, your family about your grief, and it will be okay.
And Amahra, I know you've been doing some work with kind of grief circles in the communities that you support as well and work with.
Yeah.
I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about that, because that's obviously another way of reaching out, but you are actually running those online, aren't you, rather than it just being written?
Yeah. One of the things that we acknowledge is that in a lot of communities, a lot of cultures, the way to process grief is by being with other people. Like I personally am, I'm from Caribbean descent, and we process grief typically with like 9 nights. So, 9 nights before we lay a body to rest, we gather, we celebrate life, we eat together. We have that processing time as a collective. And of course now, with the pandemic and its various impacts, we haven't been able to do that virtually. And we knew that as a society, we were going to be experiencing grief at a magnitude that we haven't done in our lifetimes. So it felt really important that we still need to make space for collective healing and processing of grief and trauma together. So we were really fortunate that we received grant support from the National Lottery Community Fund to support that activity. So we developed a season around wellbeing and care that was rooted very much in facilitating healing circles and grief circles, particularly for Black and Brown people, because we knew that they were most disproportionately impacted by death in relation to COVID-19. And so it felt really important to do that. But also there were a lot of the happenings of 2020 were, of course, much more than COVID-19. We were seeing a conversation about police brutality and death in a really public forum. And it felt that we needed to have space as a community together to process that in a COVID safe way. So it feels really important to be speaking really particularly about the intersections of race. And as I'm based in Birmingham, in a neighbourhood that over decades has been, experiencing disproportionate numbers of youth violence, of knife violence and gun crime, is that we know so often as community organisers, we are the first ones to get called, not professionals, not therapists, not doctors. We get the call to say, I need help, can you come? And that could be at the middle of the night. So I think there's something about acknowledging the power of community that a lot of communities already do.
Yeah, certainly. And what's the reception been to moving some of those activities online, moving your community work online?
It's hard because I know, so many people are saying we're missing the haptics of being together, like the feedback that we literally get when we're proximate to each other. That's not there. But it's quite extraordinary that, we have these digital tools. We have Grief Gang podcasts, and we have lots of different materials and resources to be able to tap into. It's incredible. And I also want to acknowledge that, there are lots of people who before COVID were shielding, weren't able to be together, had health needs or had disability needs that meant that they couldn't necessarily be together in a space long before COVID anyway. So I want to acknowledge that, that's always been happening. And now it feels really important that we talk about all the community being able to process together in any way that we can. It definitely feels like it's better to have this than to not.
And Julian, obviously you've been kind of working in this area of sort of community development approaches to supporting communities or allowing communities to do their thing and support each other for some time. I was just wondering, listening to Amber and Amahra talk about their experiences, how that fits in with your views and your experiences as well.
So I think it's so great to hear them both speak, because they're responding from the heart in something that's fundamentally human and not constrained by having to fit into a professional service category, but basing it on something fundamentally human. And I guess community development exists because we've forgotten what community is. And I think it's worth mentioning that actually human beings are the most social of animals. It's part of our evolution. And actually, when you look at the kind of hallmarks of what has evolution got to say about compassion, about social connection, you can find it throughout the animal kingdom. This is hundreds of millions of years of evolution, and the point about it is it's an evolutionary pressure, and it's got something behind it that says this is naturally who we are. And what that means is that when it comes to experiencing the joys and hardships of life, then we do it as a community. And there isn't a defined way of doing it. It's not like there's only one way that you can grieve. And you know, I love Amahra's comments about different cultures grieve in different ways. It's absolutely true the world over. And so I think that, you know, what's happened is that to a degree, communities have become atomized, that we've lost that sense of how we can be together. And at the same time, we've pathologized everything. We've turned everything into an illness that needs professional support. But actually, the first line, the most important thing, is the people we know and love in the places we know and love. And I think that, you know, what both Amahra and Amber are saying is that let's respond about who we are as human beings. And I love that. And I think that gets, it kind of has got hundreds of millions of years of echoes. I love that deep connection to what it is to be human, you know, and reaching out and you know, you can't give people hugs online, but it's second best and it's not nothing, you know, it's really is something.
I was interested, Amahra, in, you know, you referred to the whole conversation that's been going on around racism and the sort of collective legacy of that as well for Black communities in the UK. I wondered if you could maybe reflect on that aspect of the work that you do, and the importance really of, or your views of the importance of communities themselves coming together to tell those very difficult stories as well of experiences of discrimination or racism.
I think it's this idea that I'm a sole believer that, you know, community is everything, and that could be one other person you're in community with, or, you know, a mass community. Of all the ways that we mean community, it's everything. The other thing to acknowledge is that I know, for me personally, grief is not a linear experience, and what I'm really interested in is how grief can also be recognized for, like, ancestral mourning. Like, what does that mean, where generations have been suppressed, have been oppressed by violence when it's race-based. Part of our job is, like, how do we not only protest against that, recognize that it's happening, but then provide the space to heal from that, where we know we've lost things like our youth centres, our community centres, because of, like, funding cuts, for example. What are the new sanctuaries where we can then process grief? Where then will we process our pain and process bereavement? I know bereavement's a word that we'll come back to, but where do we go then to process that? And we, you know, we were doing a lot of work pre-pandemic because that's changed things, but in many ways it's like we need to think of new community infrastructure that can support and facilitate healing in a much more longer, non-linear sense. How can it provide space for healing in the here and now, for the things that happen here and now, but also acknowledge that grief is something that can be inherited, it can be adopted, it can live in our DNA for much longer than here and now. So where do we process all of that? And like we know, traditional healthcare and the professional services aren't equipped to deal with that.
It strikes me that what it reminds me of, or the importance of, is kind of storytelling. And how, you know, as individuals, when we're processing our grief, we almost have to keep telling our stories of what happened, of the loss we experienced, of you know, the impact it's had on our lives and our families. But then the crucial thing is that as communities, we have our community stories, don't we? And it's almost like we can only tell those stories together and to other people who understand, and or at least are listening and open to hearing those stories. And you can't really get that on the therapist's couch, can you? You can't get those community stories.
I think as well that sometimes it's about the telling of the stories of grief, but sometimes it's simply about that human connectedness and having that sense of human connectedness, which might be something very mundane. Like sharing a cup of tea with somebody and chatting about the weather, you have that sense of connection. And it might be, there are loads of examples of community activities in which the space for people to exist is there for them to, express whatever they want. And there are, things like men's sheds and walking groups, and it doesn't matter what, could be absolutely like knit and natter. That knit and natter. I somehow I love knit and natter, and I've got a friend who calls it stitch and bitch, which I think is great. And there's something about the it's a kind of fundamental aspect of humanity, and I love the idea of a group of women sitting around stitching and bitching in Neanderthal times, and actually this is a really important part of who we are as human beings. And so sometimes it's directly related to expressing the grief, and sometimes it is pure friendship.
I love a point that Amber made earlier about, the idea that you would share something about your mum and other people might really relate to that. There's something that I think that you're touching on, Julian, about the human experience, that I feel the more personal, like artistry teaches me, the more personal you make a thing, the more specific you make it to yourself, the more universal it becomes, that people all over, in whatever way feels appropriate to them, can find something about what you're sharing that they can relate to. So I think that what you're both doing in terms of storytelling and podcasting and what you're sharing is such a gift to the world.
Thank you. It's one thing I found with podcasting and things that I do on my page and the community, what a lot of people in bereavement need is permission. And that's one thing that I notice time and time again. So, for example, on my page, as well as the podcast sort of sat on the back burner because of the pandemic and it all went wild. And so I really started pouring into the Instagram page and the community and really, really engaging. And it's coming up to a year now since I started this feature. It was simply just tell the world their name. And it is one of the most emotional posts I think I ever did. And it was just simply, I just said, because I'd say my mum's name probably 50 times a day. I talk about her all the time. Talking about my mum now is my life. So for me, it's not abnormal to say my mum's name. But I know for some people, and I've noticed it from like support groups that I've attended and hosted, that some people even just saying, hello, my name is Amber and my mum Sue died. They can't even get the name off the tongue. It is so painful. So with this post, I just said, I want you to tell me and this community your loved one's name. And hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people commented their loved one's name. And it was simply just the permission. People just need permission to say, it's okay, you can say their name. Or even small, I want to know their name. I want to know what your mum was called. I want to know what your dad was called. Let's talk about them. And I've continued it every month now, and it's coming up to a year. And it's one of my favourite times, like of the month, because that is when my community really comes together. We just I sit and I read all these people's loved ones' names, and I think this is it. This is what community really is.
Mm.
It's hard, like I cry a lot at it. Like I literally sit there and it's just every post, every month that it rolls out, just more and more people. And it's another thing too, I think, holding and creating a community solely around bereavement. It's very strange when the community grows, because if I was a fashion blogger, if I was a whoever, loves to food blogger, and my community was growing, I'd be like, yeah, woo. But I'm a grief community. My community only grows because people are having people die. Mm-hmm. And that's a very sad feeling. Mm-hmm. So when opportunities like come my way, or even the community grows, like when I hit 10,000 people, and most people, they're like, yeah, 10K, woo. And I was like, that's 10,000 people who are bereaved or grieving, and they are searching for a place. I don't want to whoop about that. I'm tremendously sad about that. But then in the same breath, I'm so happy that these people, oh, I'm gonna get emotional. I'm so happy that these people are opening up their life to living happily and grieving. And if they find that in my page, they come to my page and they see this girl, she can laugh about her grief, she can laugh, just laugh, and her mum died, then so can I.
And as you say, that's about, sorry Julian, that's also about permission, isn't it? Because there are all these ideas about what you should be like when you're grieving, and what you shouldn't be like. And so I think to say, like, actually you can laugh, you can feel down, you don't have to feel down all the time, you don't have to talk all the time about it. As you said, Julian, you might just want to be with somebody and have a cup of tea, or stitch and bitch and do something completely different just to take your mind off it. That's also fine. But Julian, what were you going to say?
Well, I think as well, what is it Dickens said about death and taxes, that death, dying, loss and caregiving, that like loss in particular, loss of so many things, and pet loss, or loss of our youth, or loss of whatever it is, they happen to everyone multiple times. And the our cultural responses to it are really important and make a huge difference. And I think we're finding our way back to say, this is who we are as human beings. This is part of, the richness of life is contained within our love, our laughter, and our friendship. And that includes dealing with the hard times, whatever they are. It's a human connectedness that makes the biggest difference. And it's everyone. Nobody escapes this. This is all of us. And, one of the phrases that we use on a regular basis is that death, dying, loss and caregiving is everyone's business. And I think the more people get engaged with it and familiar with it, the more that we can support each other, the more meaningful it is, the more connected we feel. And that in itself is not just about dealing with grief. It's about the richness of life. And I'm on a bit of a polemic, so I'm going to go for it. Is that we think that wealth is the amount of money we have, and it is absolutely not. The wealth is the richness of our relationships, of who we are, of human beings, of our potential, of our innate inborn kindness that we can share with the people around us. And working as a palliative care physician, I've talked to thousands of people as they've died. And nobody said, I wish I'd spent more time at work. And the people who appreciated life most were the people who said, I've had a good life. I've had good family and friends. They didn't talk about the immense power that they'd accumulated or the fabulous wealth they had. They more or less somehow didn't really appreciate it that much. And it's the closeness of relationships that makes a difference.
And what would you guys suggest if there's somebody who feels disconnected from their communities or isolated, and that they just don't feel confident or comfortable reaching out and having those day-to-day interactions with people that can make you feel connected? And I wonder whether there aren't, especially now, it's been such a difficult time, and we know that people are feeling lonely and disconnected. What would you recommend, or what would you say to somebody who was feeling like that? Amahra?
Join Grief Gang. You know why? Because I remember, for me, I experienced the loss of my baby when I was 19, and I really suppressed that, like, for a really long time. And the first time I saw not only how much the suppression was impacting me, but how much it had directly led to me creating an organization, was I attended a death cafe, where it was essentially like a round table of people who were speaking about their loved ones, who were naming them and honoring and celebrating their life in whatever way they saw fit. And it was the first time I said my baby's name out loud. And it was in an environment that I also work around, like it was a co-working space that I was in, and I was having this conversation, and it felt like all of the boundaries in my life sort of like melted. And here I was being like my whole self, honoring the child that was no longer with me, and their life, and the fact that I could say it out loud. And in that moment, I started to see, like, it doesn't have to be like, oh, it's almost like a light bulb moment of, oh my gosh. And I didn't have, until that moment, a community that I could be my whole self with, that I could bring this part of my life to, that I could talk about my pain, my frustration, the joy, you know, my body, because, you know, my body changed, and all of those things in relation to that grief. So it feels like, in many ways, I think you don't have to be the one to set something up. You can participate in something else that somebody else had set up, in whatever way you want to be present in that. I think everyone here, like, you know, good grief, what Julian's created, what Amber's created, are things like, I'm seeing grief now as a teaching tool for me. You know, like it was, I was working in retail at the time, and I effectively lost my job because I couldn't afford, they didn't give me sick pay for the time that I was off. They didn't give me bereavement pay or anything, because essentially a crappy contract and policy thing in retail. So it was like a teaching tool for me once I became alive to the fact that I can speak about grief really presently. What policies and procedures do I want to sew into my organization? Like, how do I want to care for people? What does that look like for me now, who's able to make some of those decisions? But I could only do that after being in conversation with other people that have facilitated that space. And that was, you know, like Facebook was kind of a thing back in like 2009, but it wasn't. So now we've got so much, you know, so much richness, and so many people who are being intentional about creating spaces to talk about grief. Like, what a blessing. Thank you, guys. Thank you all.
I think that's, you know, it's such an important point, isn't it, that actually there's so many different ways of reaching out, and nowadays you can just join a Facebook group or you know, an Instagram page. You don't have to, like, you know, muster up the courage to go along to something and be there in person. And so I suppose, yeah, there's a richness and a joy in that there are options, and there need to be those different options and different types of communities, don't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's for somebody who maybe is lacking sense of like support in their close and personal support networks. Like I say, I would come to the grief gang, come see me, but not just see me, come and see the whole community. Like when I started Grief Gang, I was really under the illusion that I had done something groundbreaking and started a grief page. And lo and behold, when I started the account and started searching like the hashtag grief and looking for other accounts, I can only describe it as literally walking to like grief Disneyland. I was like, literally, there were just so many accounts. And I was like, Abby, you silly cow, why did you're not the first person to have a mum die. Like, you're not the first and you won't be the last. But with that, I was like, where have they been my whole bereavement journey? And I started scouring through it. It's just like when grieving was very early and I hadn't really posted anything. And I'm just looking just to see what this is like. And the people that are already paving the way already, the support groups that were already out there, I was like, okay, this is it. Like, this is it. These are my people. And I started attending like different support groups. Like I've been to so many different support groups, and I finally found like my one now. But you can attend, especially now with being virtual. I think there's almost a bit of a benefit for things being virtual now. As I went to my first support group in person, and I'll never forget it. It was in a bar in Bank in London. I walked in, and it was like, I'll never forget, I walked up to this group, it was congregating big people, and I went, I'll never forget, I went, are you the grief group? And they went, no. I was like, oh my God, no. I was like, there was no sign to say grieving. And then I wanted these like bank men, like, and they're like, no. And I was like, I'm so embarrassed. But thankfully I found them and it was okay. But something like that, like I'm thick skinned, something like that's okay for me. I was like, okay, whatever. But for somebody who's not, that's so daunting. Something about having virtual support groups now, like you can just log on, you don't have to put your camera or your mic on, you can just come and get a feel for it. And if it's not for you, sack it off, you can leave. And if it is for you, you keep coming back. It's in the comfort of your own home as well. You can sit in bed in your dressing gown if you want, a cup of tea. And you can sit and listen to like-minded people who've been through something like you and just feel part of a community. And if and when, or if you might not ever want to speak, but the opportunity is there for you to speak, and that space. One thing as well about this community is that you don't have to worry about the space being held for you. You don't have to think, okay, well, if I essentially say whoever's, you know, they're feeling they don't have the support in their personal network, you often, I found, I would have to get a little bit of feelers of who I would really speak to my grief about. So I'd kind of dabble and be like, oh, like, really miss my mum, and kind of look at them for their reaction, like, are you gonna address it? Are you gonna probe me to carry on? And if they weren't, I'd be like, shut off. But in the grief community, in the online space, you don't have to worry about that. They're gonna go, yeah, tell me about that, talk to me about that, and you will never be shut down. There's always a space for you. So 100% get online, get on the community, get following these pages, find the ones that really speak to you.
I'd like to turn the question on its head a little, as is my habit, in that for many people who are feeling lonely and isolated, that part of the reason that they feel like that is that whatever it takes to get out and do something about it, it can be too much for them for a whole variety of different reasons. And so in a way, you know, the fact that people are lonely and isolated is a loss of community, a loss of that sense of the care of the people around us. You know, and there are stories of people who are not discovered for 3 months until after they've died. And that, in a way, that's a kind of definition of loneliness and isolation. And I think that there's something that I completely agree about reaching out, if you can reach out, but it's all our responsibility to reach out and find the people in our communities who are lonely and isolated. You know, do you know your neighbors who you know, that the curtains twitch when you walk by? Because those people are likely to be lonely and isolated. And where are the conversations happening? And for goodness sake, you know, this British thing is don't look over the garden fence. Look over the garden fence and ask your neighbor how they are, and ask them if they want a cup of tea. Do you like one of the podcasts I did it with a documentary filmmaker called Paddy Wivel. And he described, you know, he lives in North London, and he said his road, down one end of the road is an MP, and down the other end of the road is a housing estate. And every day he goes into the same shop to get his newspaper. And he didn't know the name of the guy in the shop, even though he'd been in there every day for years. And there's something about, you know, talk to your neighbors, find out their names. If you go into a shop, ask about their names. And in a way, the shopkeepers are the small shopkeepers, are the people who know their community, because they definitely know the old, the frail, the infirm, the people with dementia who come in on a regular basis and want to have a chat about what it is. Likewise, hairdressers, likewise, cafe owners, you know, like we all have a role to play in simply talking to the people around us and looking out for them.
Yeah, that's so true. It's so true. It is all of our responsibility.
Yeah, definitely a duty. And I think, yeah, that said, Julian, and what you said earlier about death, dying, and palliative care being everybody's business, I like to say too, it's, you know, death is, out of all the things in life that are uncertain, death is one that is very certain. So why are we not talking about it? And it really makes me laugh, because some people really think they're immune to it, and the people in their life are immune to it. And I suppose it's a bit stark, and I'm a little bit brutal with it. And I'll be like, your mum will die one day, so you should probably get used to speaking or having these conversations with the people in your life, having these meaningful talks, and getting to really know your loved one, because know that death can creep up on any of us at any given time. So let's not, we're all on borrowed time.
I think that, from to draw it back a little, and when you're talking about compassion, is that historically compassion has almost been owned by religions, and I think this is something of an error, because I think we can look and see compassion everywhere. And if you're thinking about what we hope, we wrote this book, The Compassion Project, which is about compassion and the application of it, and the consequences of applying it, and in a way, we think about it as 3 ways to really inspire people to be more compassionate. There's reasoning and logic, and when you look at reasoning and logic, the evidence that compassion is helpful is overwhelming. If you want to lead long, healthy, happy lives, be compassionate. And the evidence for that is everywhere. It's much more effective than nearly every single medicine we have. There's emotion. So emotion, like being more compassionate, is you kind of go, I was compassionate in that moment and it felt good. And it wasn't, I was giving something purely out of human goodness and not for expectation of return. And that felt good. And I would like some more of that. Thank you very much. And then there's inspiration, and that's when you see an example of great compassion. And it might be on a podcast, it might be through participating in a group, it might be through artwork, it might be just be witnessing something on a film or whatever it is, and you think, oh my God, that was so meaningful. I would like to be that. And what we hope is that, and beg and pray and everything else that we possibly can manage, is please elevate compassion as a primary value of importance in your life, because it helps everything. And if we're going to face the disaster of where it looks like we're going to need compassion. That survival of the kindest is much better phrase than survival of the fittest, and so that whatever way you can, put it into practice in small steps in your life. And that includes looking out for your neighbor and saying, you look really sad, what's going on? Or I'm sorry to hear about the person that you love that's ill or has died. Something simple like that, just that human connectedness. So I think that there's a place for it everywhere, and the more we can do it, the better. And it's addictive as well.
I would really like the survival of the kindest merchandise when you're ready. Thanks, Julian.
Great idea. I think it's you who needs to make it. Let's work together on it.
Love it.
Do you think some of the changes that have come about during the pandemic are sort of here to stay? Do you think some of the more positive changes maybe will be beneficial in the years to come, or are we looking at a society that is more divided and also obviously hugely bereaved through this experience as well?
I think from what I see from my own community, I think I as I said, as Julian said, we hope, we beg, we pray that we as a society, how can we go back after a year of such intense loss for everybody? Even if you haven't had somebody die, everybody has been touched by the pandemic, be it loss of lifestyle, loss of job, everyone has lost something, loss of mental health. Everybody has lost something through this pandemic, but more specifically for the people who have been largely bereaved by death. I'd like to think that we physically cannot go back to a society where we weren't. We can't ignore the year of 2020 and 21. We cannot put the year of COVID and the pandemic. And I've spoke about this on the page, and I just thought we'd be damned as a society if we did that. Because with us doing that, if we were to go, and I thought about it a lot about New Year, around New Year time. And a lot of people were like, yeah, goodbye 2020, get rid of that one, like goodbye. And I can appreciate that. But I wrote and I said, for some people, they don't want to say goodbye to 2020, because 2020 for some people was the last time they saw their loved ones alive and they were with them. So we have to respect that, and we have to honour that the year that you want to forget about, there's thousands of people who don't want to forget about this year, and they won't. As much as they try with every being of them, they won't be able to forget about this year, because they lost someone so core in their life that this year is grained in them. So I like to think, especially like with the media, us guys and Julian, we've been talking about grief for pre-pandemic. We've been doing the work. And obviously now the media and everything like that wants in, and they want to interview us and talk to us and get our ideas and stuff like that. It's like, babes, I've been here doing this and I'll be doing it during, and I'll be doing it after as well. I only hope and pray that mainstream media will continue this conversation and continue and pushing the work of people, because it was very interesting when the COVID death rate hit 100,000. Everything just went, oh, here's all the support you can get. And I thought, you should have been doing this back in April. You should have been doing this back in April of 2020 when the first person died, and we've seen a mortality rate going up. People are dying, and they needed support back then, and they'll need it forevermore. So I'd like to think that we all, not just even media, in our everyday lives, everyone remembers 2020 and 21, the year that we really started talking about the tough things. We really started thinking about our mortality and our loved ones' mortality, and that people die and they die unexpectedly. And with that, there are families and loved ones left behind who need to speak about it.
I think that leads really nicely. I wanted to talk about this idea that's been going around sort of some sort of collective coming together, or memorial. At this time this session goes out, there would have just been the day of reflection that Marie Curie charity was sort of spearheading. What do you think is needed on a community level, but also on a sort of national level, to help us get through what we've been through, what we're still going through now with the pandemic? Amahra, do you have any thoughts about that?
My instinctive response was, we need to honour and celebrate those that we've lost. We need and we need to name them. It comes back to what both of you have said, is that people were made statistics immediately and were instantly dehumanized in that. And I don't know how we can realistically, as a nation, mourn and move on from that without honouring, naming and celebrating people. So that to me feels like the very first thing. And then I think it's from on a community level, that's very much like each community and all the sort of myriads of what community means. That's for them to decide how they need to process their grief. What they need is time. What they need is space to be and to work that out together, virtually or in real life, safely. And they need to be able to mindfully process and create that on a state level. The state has to then resource, how do you create that time? How do you not rush people back into unhealthy working patterns or reliance on the state that doesn't then, lend itself to being mindful in community with each other? I think that there needs to be a total recognition of the humanity within what we've just experienced, and not just the statistics, and that needs to come from the state level.
And I would like to, echo that and also link it to the last question, because I think that there's something going on. and that something isn't happening in the institutions of the world, including the media and politics and business, but something is arising from communities. And you see it happening in all kinds of different ways. And whether it's asset-based community development or flat pack democracy or whatever it is, there's a sense of communities actually coming to the fore. And I think it's really important that the National Day of Mourning is a great idea, but we don't leave it at that. And I think we do need a national response. And there are so many ways in which communities can support people who are going through bereavement. But a very simple idea, for example, is something like having a bereavement chat, and about that opportunistic moment where people go shopping or they go to the cafe and there's a table there and somebody has put just a piece of paper on the table saying friendly bereavement chat, and people can drop in and out of that. And you can do that anywhere, and everyone needs to go shopping. And it's like so much happens in that moment where you go out and you have that unexpected chat. And I would say that, and this is an ongoing discussion that we're having with professional palliative care services and bereavement charities and the like, is to say, look, there's a part of this which is a whole community, whole population response. There's a part of this that doesn't need professional control. You don't need an expert in the room to share the love and compassion with the people around you. And thinking about how can we make sure that these bereavement chats, that they happen everywhere. There is a space for people to drop in and out. They happen online and they happen person to person as well. And I think we need a national response of making sure that close to every GP practice, on a Tuesday morning down the Cheese and Grain, you can go down there and know that there's somebody at a table who has just put bereavement chat or something there, and you can drop by and chat about things. And that every GP surgery knows that that's happening, and knows that if they ask somebody or say something like, I'm sorry to hear about your bereavement, there is a place they can direct that person to so that they know they're getting support, rather than going, I'm sorry about your bereavement, but there's a 3-month waiting list for anyone to get any support. And I'd rather not mention it because it's embarrassing. So I think there is a national response to this, that we can do it through community development and go to the people rather than expect the people to come to us.
And that needs resourcing.
It does.
Needs resourcing really well.
It's very true. It's not a case of, especially in the community, that there's lack of bereavement support. It's a fact of we're not being signposted, we're not being told about. So, like, for example, when the media now is shedding light on so many communities online, I've had hundreds of people message me saying, I've been looking for, I've wanted something like this. And I was like, I've been here for 2 years, babe. Like, I've been here. It's just only now mainstream media wants to talk about it. And it's great, but we need to keep that up. I'd also love to see grief in education. But I mean, that's a whole different ball game. But I would love to see it on a curriculum somewhere. Maybe that's my next challenge.
I think even that's one of the things that we've been exploring, like the Emerging Futures grant that we got from the National Lottery, was how do you then design systems and structures that can facilitate that? And I feel like it's what needs resourcing is for people like us, for people who are, processing and building things through that, to be resourced to then dream up, to imagine, to think about, and create beyond what we have right now. That needs adequate resourcing.
Yeah, I think that's a really lovely place to finish. Thank you all so much. I've really enjoyed talking to you all. I think we've had a very rich and fascinating discussion. So huge thanks, and take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.